All right. So this paper is kind of or this presentation rather, is kind of an adaptation on a paper that I wrote last year. So everything as of now should be completely up to date. If there is anything that you might think otherwise, please let me know. But otherwise, let's dive right into it. So actually, since the actual title that I submitted for this conference, it's changed. So I've now changed it to a critical race theory analysis of prison rape of queer and trans people of color in the United States. Okay, so firstly, before you're able to talk about rape in prisons, I would like to firstly discuss mass incarceration. So currently in the United States, people are incarcerated at a rate of 750 per 100,000 people, and 60% of those are ethnic minorities. This makes the United States one of the world's leading jailers. The next closest to that is in Russia, that has a rate of 628 per 100,000. Among incarcerated Americans, people of color are disproportionately represented, more than 60% of ethnic minorities. Through the systemic persecution and prosecution of mainly black bodies, beginning with the Reagan administration's supposed war on drugs, the prison population exploded during the 1980s, filling and overfilling prisons with non-whites. This impacts minority communities, despite consistent reports of similar drug uses among races. This system of criminalizing racial minorities results from a distinct inequality of criminalization, despite proportional rates of drug uses across ethnicities. African Americans see higher incarceration rates of any other ethnicity and experience harsher punishments for similar violations. In the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argues that the criminal justice system is the United States' new racial caste. Okay, so to take kind of like a psychosocial as well as a critical race theory analysis to this issue. Queer and trans people of color are disproportionately affected by mass incarceration. So within prison walls, and this is kind of the whole main part of my argument in the paper that I was writing, within prison walls, rape actually becomes a tool to ensure the success of mass incarceration, permanently suppressing queer and trans people of color. Mass incarceration results in the systemic rape in the name of justice. So the use of rape redirects the anger that black inmates feel towards other inmates as opposed to the system itself. Mass incarceration systemically controls inmates by staff, allowing rapes to continue between inmates and by raping inmates themselves. So one interesting thing that I saw when reviewing the literature was, which I'll talk a little bit later, that a mass majority of minorities, specifically queer and trans people of color, were actually raped more by prison staff members themselves as opposed to other inmates. Rape victims get longer sentences for trying to protect themselves by being violent, and complicating the issue of male prison rape is homophobia and masculinity. The notion that male rape victims asked to be raped because they are gay. As such, male victims often feel great shame and emasculation as a result of their rape. Prison officials often fail to consider the rape of gay men as rape. LGBT individuals, and those who may fit into LGBT stereotypes, for example, feminine features or passive personalities, are much more likely than other prisoners to be targeted for abuse. That was from the Transgender Law Center. And due to overcrowding and under-resourcing, many prisons cannot provide adequate mental health services to inmates. For those that do provide mental health services, many of the service providers often lack in expertise in suicide prevention and rape trauma. Many prison systems also lack the resources to prevent and treat STDs that result from overcrowding. Thus, many prison rape victims may have HIV or other STDs and not know, or many may know, but they lack the access to the necessary resources to actually treat their condition. I'll go ahead and skip this. Okay. So just to give a snapshot, now that we've kind of discussed mass incarceration and how it ties in with prison rape, in the United States, 200,000 people are raped in prison every year, and that's primarily made up of queer and trans people of color. And I'll highlight more about the actual or perceived on LGBT status in a sec. I discussed this a little more in my paper, and I kind of just wanted to nudge on this here and not go too far in depth. But in terms of prison rape in the public, the levity in which the media treats this issue indicates its complicity with prison rape, either due to belief that a prison sentence implicitly entails rape, that prison rape should be used as a crime deterrent, or that prison rape is merely a joke. And that's evidenced by various mass media portrayals of rape in the public, often treating it as a joke, something to make fun of, something that's inherently, oh, well, now that you've been incarcerated, this is something that you deserve. The real needs of inmates and the seriousness of the issue is consistently and constantly undermined by messages that the public need not consider prison rape as a real societal, political, or policy concern, and that those who experience prison rape must deserve it. The white supremacist nature of the criminal justice system requires the support of the media and apathy of the public. Through the media, the criminal justice system has shaped public opinion toward believing that black and brown folks are by nature or culture inherently criminals. Criminals are less than human, and thus, inhumane violence can be tolerated within prisons. Without the support of media, the criminal justice system could not so blatantly achieve its goal of racial and heteropatriarchal subjugation. So, one of the things, so I'm a policy student, so one of the things I was really interested in is discussing policy and legislation regarding regulating prison rape, one of which was the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And PREA, or PREA for short. PREA was enacted in 2003, and this kind of gives a little bit of legislative background around it, and still utilizing a little bit of a CRT lens. So, the Human Rights Watch sought to investigate prison rape, and they actually conducted a study in 1996, because prior there was actually no literature on the prevalence of prison rape. We knew, as a public, it was in public consciousness, everyone knew it existed, but no one actually, there wasn't any research that was done to the extent of it, any empirical research. So in 1996, the Human Rights Watch publishes All Too Familiar: Sexual Abuse of Women in United States Prisons. And after that was published, about 5 years later, in 2001, the Human Rights Watch publishes Prior to No Escape: Male Prisoner Rape in the United States. And something that's interesting is that in 2001, this issue, specifically focusing on male rape, actually ended up on the New York Times cover. It garnered national attention, and it was actually the impetus for and utilizing congressional testimony that ended up passing PREA. So what was interesting is that even though 5 years prior that this study was done on actually looking at the scope of prison rape for women, that was largely ignored, which I think kind of highlights some themes. Let's see. And actually, this was further reflected in the initial draft of the Prison Rape Elimination Act because it solely addressed male prison rape in its initial draft. After receiving feedback on this draft, the Prison Rape Elimination Act included sexual misconduct as when staff were perpetrators, but it's still, the sole focus remained on male-to-male prison rape, which is an apparent example of the manifestations of society's preferential treatment towards males. These series of events connote that it is more unacceptable for a man to get raped than a female. And in terms of organizations that were helping to push this issue, many religious institutions framed this issue as an issue of a gay man spreading their disease. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Prison Rape Elimination Act and its outcomes. It was enacted in 2003, and it wasn't actually implemented in 2012 because a lot of what it mandated to do kind of took a lot of time. So one of it was that it actually mandated annual research to be done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics to establish a commission on national prison rape elimination, as well as a set of series of standards of prevention, response, and data collection, which prior to that, absolutely nothing was been done, as well as allocating various funds, $60 million that went to the states to provide trainings, improve investigation structures, installation of surveillance equipment, enhance medical and mental health treatment, and hire staff to actually implement a lot of the national standards. So to dig a little bit deeper into these standards, The first portion of the standards cover prevention planning. PREA-compliant agencies must adopt a zero-tolerance policy on sexual abuse and harassment. The standards also outline specific criteria on inmate monitoring and supervision, limitations on cross-gender viewing and searches, as well as facility upgrades, including video cameras to help with prevention. Officers must screen all inmates for their risk of victimization and abusiveness within 72 hours of entry or transfer to a facility. This information is then utilized to inform housing, bed, work, and education and program assignments. So on a broader scale, facilities are required to establish and implement a consistent staff, volunteer, and contractor trainer program, including specialized training for mental health and medical professionals. Furthermore, the prison must engage in data collection, sexual abuse incident reviews, audits, and an audit correction plan. And the whole goal of all of these preventative standards that I just alluded to are to abate sexual misconduct before it occurs. And should an incident occur, facilities must have response and protocol in place for forensic medical examinations and policies around referrals of allegations for investigations. Let's see. All right. So those are the outcomes. Those are the intended outcomes when actually enacting this policy. I wanted to highlight some of the unintended consequences that happened as a result. So firstly, one of the huge issues with PREA, it was great that it had allocated a lot of funding to comply with these national standards. It was great they actually set these national standards when before it was completely ignored and unacknowledged prior. However, there's really no accountability to comply with PREA. Essentially, prisons get a 5% reduction in federal funding if they don't comply. So while there's a wealth of knowledge and trainings, they don't technically have to comply if they really don't want to. Another issue is with grievance procedures. So in a lot of facilities, certain staff are the point person PREA staff that an inmate must go to, excuse me, to obtain information on filing a complaint. This is hugely problematic if a victim would face enormous hurdle if the perpetrator that they're filing a complaint against is the actual point person. It's unfair and unreasonable for legislation to impose a statute of limitations on reporting a serious crime that should be addressed regardless of the time frame since the incident occurred. So another issue with grievance is that they're only allowed a certain period of time to do that. And after the statute of limitations has ended, they're no longer able to do so. Screenings. While the actual national standards mandate that screenings should occur, well, firstly, there's really no considerations for women. The goal of these screening standards is to keep the individuals of high-risk victimization away from those at high risk for committing abuse. Inmates are supposed to be screened within 72 hours of arrival at a facility using an objective screening instrument. However, there's currently no nationally validated risk assessment tool that is currently in operation, making it difficult for facilities to comply. The screening standards fail to offer recommendations on how to screen women differently than men, which is unsurprising, as the impetus for legislation was the male experience of rape during incarceration. This is highly problematic, as there are huge differences in patterns of abusiveness and victimization among genders. For example, a greater proportion of incarcerated women have histories of prior sexual victimization than women in the general population. According to the ACLU, approximately 85 to 90% of incarcerated women have a history of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Some jurisdictions have found ways to successfully manage individuals who specifically screen as vulnerable to sexual abuse within general population housing units. Jurisdictions that do this effectively have three major characteristics in common. They emphasize the importance of a strong screening and rescreening process administered by trained staff and monitored by high-level supervisors. Second, they manage and deploy their existing staff resources to keep vulnerable inmates safe. Third, all decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. So this is another unintended consequence that I wanted to highlight. one of which is administrative segregation. So this, so basically screening risk is utilized in housing placements. And according to the Prison Rape Elimination Act, facilities are able to place victims in segregating housing against their will if a determination in the screening has been made that no alternative means of separation is available with periodic reassessment. So while the intention is to remove the inmate from potential risk of rape, other unfortunate outcomes occur as a result of administrative segregation. Inmates that are placed in administrative segregation are often placed in the same location and endure the same conditions as those in disciplinary segregation. And those placed in administrative segregation are supposed to be given access to programs, privileges, education, and work opportunities to the extent possible. And on the ground level, a lot of interpretation of the word "to the extent possible," given that they're given such significant flexibility, isn't happening. They're being funneled with all the other individuals that are in disciplinary segregation. They're typically prevented from participating in drug treatment, education, and job training programs. In addition to being denied access to programs, there are a lot of mental health issues that one needs to consider as well. Of those that were analyzed in this study, about 41% had hallucinations, 27% had suicidal ideation. There were a lot of neuropsychological implications as well in terms of hippocampal reduction, which has a lot to do with your memory, all of which contribute to underreporting, since there is inherently a sense of self-blame that's highlighted in individuals that have been raped in prison. They've been oppressed, they've been criminalized, they are then placed into administrative segregation. So when one is constantly under all of these various constraints, environments, then it becomes very difficult to feel empowered enough to report, and you also tend to blame yourself. Prison necessitates that one's program and housing assignments are reassessed at least twice a year to review threats to safety experienced by the inmate. This is highly troublesome, especially if someone was incorrectly assessed as needing separate housing and are thus placed in or administrative segregation for up to 6 months. 67% of all LGBT people in prison report being assaulted, making them among the most vulnerable population in prison. In 2014, the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 40% of transgender prisoners are sexually abused each year. The vulnerability of LGBT prisoners has led many prisons to separate them from other prisoners. And being LGBT in itself is not enough to justify a request for protective housing. Actually, agencies can't discipline an individual for not disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity. However, there is a follow-up to that initial part. The Prison Rape Elimination Act actually states that intake screenings should consider whether an inmate is perceived to be LGBTQ. This does not apply to lockups, given the short nature of their stay. Thus, it is up to screening staff to make this determination. All right, conclusion. So essentially, the funding, research, national standards components of the Prison Rape Elimination Act are fantastic. They are absolutely necessary to tackle this problem. However, PREA, in just a larger context, fails to address the core issue, the mass criminalization of non-whites. As I've conveyed, the Prison Rape Elimination Act hasn't done much for queer and trans people of color. Rather, many of the unintended consequences are directed at the queer and trans people of color, perpetuating this inequality from the beginning of mass incarceration. In the effort to solve the issue of prison rape, advocates cannot ignore the omnipresence of the criminal justice system and its ripple effects in the lives of the disenfranchised. The Prison Rape Elimination Act does much to improve the lives of those within the system, but merely acts as a band-aid of the larger issue of a racist criminal justice system. And to close, the Prison Rape Elimination Act does not and cannot act as a solution to prison rape solution. In a system that incarcerates entire communities, targets entire classes, subjugates all minorities, acts as an oppressive force in all lives except for the non-poor whites, and protects non-poors above all others, mass incarceration requires a tool from within to prevent the mass organizing and mobilization of those that it ensnares. The tool is prison rape. Mass incarceration works to give all inmates life sentences, regardless of the sentence doled out by judges and juries. It operates by ensuring that those who leave the system lack the resources, tools, and strength to survive on their own, that those who leave have little choice but to return. Prison rape plays a key role in the strategy of domination. It leaves individuals isolated, damaged, and afraid. Ultimately, the Prison Rape Elimination Act fails to address the core of the issue, the mass criminalization of non-whites. In the effort to solve the issue of prison rape, advocates cannot ignore the omnipresence of the criminal justice system and its ripple effects in the lives of those disenfranchised. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, now we have Megan Woolsey. The title I have is Don't Dream It, Be It, The Reparative Impulse in the Horror Camp of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So today I'm rolling out some of my dissertation research that I haven't really shared in a public forum before, so I'm really excited to share it with you all today. So my talk, Don't Dream It, Be It, The Reparative Impulse in the Horror Camp of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, fits into a larger project about music and the representation of sexuality in horror films in the 1970s in the US. And so I'm just going to start with a little bit of background and then move on into an application of Eve Sedgwick's theories of the reparative impulse. So the horror film in the United States has long been a source of ambivalent and complicated representations of sexuality as threat. The genre's basic categories of characters, monsters and their makers, killers and their victims, represent, in film scholar Robin Wood's estimation, the terror and anxiety circulating around sexuality in a society that depends upon its repression. He elaborates, quote, "The release of sexuality in the horror film is always presented as perverted, monstrous, and excessive, whether it takes the form of vampires, giant ants, or Mrs. Bates," end quote. In particular, the horror film allows for the contemplation of the sexuality of others, of combinations of countless intersecting identity categories, through narratives in which normality comes into contact with a monster of some kind. The horror film, then, stages conflicts between normality and sexuality, depicting sexuality as that which threatens to undo society, a threat that sometimes repels and disgusts, sometimes compels and entices, and more often than not, rapidly oscillates between the two poles of affective response, often engaging a number of other responses in the process. Music is an integral part of the engagement of these affective responses to sexuality in the horror film, and by extension, an integral part of the affective responses to sexuality in the broader political sphere as well. The Rocky Horror Picture Show from 1975 provides a tidy summary of Wood's observations about the horror film. It is the story of a young, all-American couple, Brad Majors and Janet Weiss, who encounter the repellent yet enticing Dr. Frankenfurter, his servants Riff Raff and Magenta, various groupies, and his creation, the hunky, blonde Rocky, after their car breaks down in the rain. Over the course of the film, the two are exposed to a variety of terrifying and titillating goings-on in the creepy mansion, culminating in the shaking of their respective sexual foundations and the dramatic but inevitable demise of their host. In this presentation, I would like to explore the film as an archive of what theorist Eve Sedgwick calls the reparative impulse in camp. In the fourth chapter of Touching Feeling, Sedgwick outlines what she perceives to be the affective orientation of the dominant critical mode for anti-homophobic theory, paranoia, and wonders if there are other ways to explore our cultural surroundings while still acknowledging the oppressive structures that govern our lives and manifest them in our cultural products. Paranoia as an affective orientation, she says, offers, quote, infinitely doable and teachable protocols of unveiling, end quote, and is motivated by a desire to avoid unpleasant surprises by predicting and unveiling systemic oppression. In short, the desire of the paranoid impulse is the forestalling of shame and other negative affects, whereas the desire of the reparative impulse, the orientation she proposes, is the maximizing of pleasure and positive affects, as she clearly states. And I'm reading from the reparative column there. The desire of the reparative impulse, on the other hand, is additive and accretive. Its fear, a realistic one, is that the culture surrounding it is inadequate or inimical to its nurture. It wants to assemble and confer plenitude on an object that will then have resources to offer to an inchoate self. Such additive and accretive practices for survival lie, she says, quote, and this is from this slide, quote, barely recognized and little explored at the heart of many histories of gay, lesbian, and queer intertextuality. That is to say, Sedgwick is interested in turning a reparative eye and ear to such archives of reparative strategies. I will now demonstrate some of the ways in which the eminently campy Rocky Horror Picture Show, whose citational acrobatics span decades of media, from lingerie advertisements and bodybuilding icons to punk fashion, 1950s rock and roll, and many exploitative and pulpy genres of film, television, and literature, such as science fiction, horror, and sexploitation. The visual and musical codes of glam rock and punk offer these resources to the horror musical, resulting in a camp that fuses horror and queer glamour. Rocky Horror Picture Show invites an embrace of the queer monster, a kind of reparative queer negativity, a valorization of the queer monster that has proven wildly popular and durable over the years. So now I'd like to lay the framework for thinking through this reparative queer negativity, which sometimes can seem a little counterintuitive. A lot of the work around the reparative impulse tends towards a slightly more positive, kind of warm, fuzzy thing. So a reparative queer negativity here. And so then I'm going to provide an example or two of how this functions musically. While the cinematic genre references of the Rocky Horror Picture Show have been documented and discussed exhaustively, a similar tracking of the musical references in the film has yet to be undertaken, to my knowledge. However, the inspiration for the characters clearly comes from musical iconography as much as cinematic, and the songs in the film often provide the venue for characters to express their emotions, as it would in a classic musical. But Rocky Horror is a little bit unique in its combination of genres here. One would not initially think that the musical and the horror film would be compatible, right? The one kind of striving for utopia, the other very nihilistic and violent. But one of the reparative strategies that Rocky Horror Picture Show employs is this combination of a traditionally gay male-centric camp deployment of glamour in the context of the Hollywood musical with a differing strain of camp that arises out of the reading and interpretation of genre codes particular to horror. Again, these sensibilities may seem initially incompatible, but they are unified in several ways. First of all, horror films and musical films were some of the first places one could find representations of queerness in American film. From the predatory lesbian vampire of Dracula's Daughter to Everett Edward Horton's fussy sissy sidekicks of RKO's Cycle of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films. The horror and musical film both rely on displays of excess, and both therefore structure their narratives around fantastic conceptions of the world. By channeling potentially damning responses to non-normative sexuality and gender, that is laughter and fear, the horror film musical offers a fascinating example of the reparative negotiation with queer negativity to which I alluded at the beginning of my presentation. Another way in which Rocky Horror is negotiating this queer negativity is through its creation of a glamour that floats free of bodily referent, a trait it draws from glam rock but alters for its own purposes, specifically in the figure of Dr. Frankenfurter. Glamour, as musicologist Lloyd Whitesell defines it in a piece on what he calls gender magic in the movie musical, is, quote, an aesthetic category evoking emotions of envy, excitement, or desirous identification. That is both an image and an emotional attitude. And according to Whitesell, anything can be glamorized. Crime, the frontier, a laboratory, even death. But when applied to gender, it tends to result in a highly idealized formation, usually the epitome of masculinity or femininity. And so this is where Rocky Horror kind of takes a turn from what the traditional musical would be doing. Theatrical rock and rollers like David Bowie and Elton John, pictured here just because the kind of similarity in the sunglasses, would take their fashion cues from the feminine glamour in many classic Hollywood films and initially began to flaunt a nostalgically clothed gender-bending style, which for Bowie soon evolved out of this planet and into a series of looks that were literally alien in character. And so this in particular, I think I had one earlier, were looks that Rocky Horror and punk culture would embrace and exploit. So what does a glamour that does not tend towards a highly idealized single gender formation look like? If you've seen the film, I'm sure you already know, but I'd like to refresh our memories about this. So at this point in the narrative, Brad and Janet have stumbled upon a convention of unconventional conventionalists. And they are dancing a strange dance that the two of them do not know. The scene resembles a common narrative trope in pulp novels in which kind of the good girl or good boy stumbles upon a gay bar and kind of suddenly realizes they're not in a, as Janet says, a wholesome, healthy place. So just let's take a look at the introduction to Dr. Frankenfurter here. And hopefully it will work. Where is the audio? Okay, there's no audio cable. Yeah, let's try that. Okay.
So unhealthy.
It's just a party, Janet.
Well, I want to go.
Well, we can't go anywhere till I get to a phone.
Well, then ask the butler or someone.
Just a moment, Janet. We don't want to interfere with their celebration.
This isn't the Junior Chamber of Commerce, Brad.
They're probably foreigners, ways different than our own. They may do some more folk dancing.
Okay, for time purposes, I'm going to cut it off there. I think that kind of gives you the idea of the points I'm trying to make here, right? So, film theorist Chris Strayer talks about the ways in which his presentation is different than kind of traditional drag, in that both the feminine and the masculine characteristics are both kind of played up. And to conclude, though, to kind of bring it back down around to what a reparative queer negativity might be like, I'm going to turn to the always contentious Lee Edelman. I'd love to talk about him during the Q&A. But in his polemic Call to Theoretical Arms, No Future, he suggests that rather than attempting to take on the mantle of reproductive futurity demanded by heteronormativity, queers should instead use their sexuality and the negativity freighted onto them because of it to communicate messages of dissent and refusal, that they should say, quote, explicitly what law and the Pope and the whole of the symbolic order for which they stand here anyway in each and every expression of or manifestation of queer sexuality, which is fuck the social order and the child in whose name we're collectively terrorized, fuck the whole network of the symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop. In short, the queer is a monster in the symbolic and should leverage that position to do real damage to the system of politics in which everything he argues is concerned with the perpetuation of reproductive futurity. So I will cut it off there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Morgan, sorry. That was fantastic. And I'm sorry to cut you off. We probably will need to go a little bit beyond our time to give you a chance to speak with our presenters today. And next we have Carl Schottmiller, and I will allow you to introduce your paper.
My presentation today is looking at American Horror Story Freak Show and how it's using freak discourse to elevate the oppression of white gay men at the expense of other marginalized communities. Set in Jupiter, Florida in 1952, American Horror Story Freak Shows follows one of the last remaining freak show troupes as they navigate the declining public interest in their business. In developing this season, series co-creator Ryan Murphy highlights discrimination against people with disabilities as the overarching element of horror. As he says, quote, "What happened to this group of people is an American horror story, and he hopes that the show's audience will, quote, take away a respect for what this group of people went through, which I found to be very moving." To tell this story, the show's casting department hires more actors with disabilities than it has for any other season. Murphy seeks out individuals who want to be actors but lack regular job opportunities, as well as individuals without acting experience whose personal stories he finds, quote, moving. Murphy hopes that through their representation on the show, the, quote, special ability cast gives a voice to many people who don't have a voice. By choosing this subject matter, American Horror Story's creative team presents a fictionalized account of freak show history that exploits the actors with disabilities, erases the nuances of intersectionality, and frames white gay men as more marginalized than people with disabilities. In developing a television season around the history of freak shows, Murphy and series co-creator Brad Falchuk contribute to a long-established tradition of freak discourse. Rosemary Garland Thompson theorizes freak discourse as a gauge for registering the different ways Western cultures interpret extraordinary bodies. These interpretations necessarily differ according to the specific socio-historical moments in which the extraordinary body exists. During the height of freak show popularity, a medical model of disability that frames freaks as deviant or pathological did not yet exist. Instead, non-disabled people largely viewed the disabled as wondrous creatures who were not entirely human. In this formulation, a freak was not a quality within individuals or a fixed identity, but rather a socially constructed category that produced in order to differentiate typical from atypical bodies. Through infrequent, the process by which individual variations become stylized as cultural otherness, freak shows turned an extraordinary body into a hypervisible text against which an onlooker's body read as normal. During the exhibitions, showmen used the practices of costuming, staging, fictional histories, choreography, and marketing to enfreak 4 groups of people: disabled people, both white and people of color; non-disabled people of color from colonized countries, framed as cannibals and savages; non-disabled people of color from the United States, framed as natives and exotics from the wild; and non-disabled people with visible differences. Racist and ableist ideologies made the social construction of these groups into freaks possible, as freak shows capitalized on the eugenicist belief that cognitively disabled individuals and people of color represented a missing link between primates and humans. The public display of these marked bodies helped to create and strengthen the typical white onlooker's sense of white identity and white supremacy, as the spectator projected savagery onto the person of color and reinforced the supposed distinction between civilized and uncivilized peoples. Whereas historically freak discourse emphasized differences between the spectator and freak, American Horror Story's deployment of freak discourse promotes a universalist ideology that emphasizes shared humanity between typical and atypical bodies. The season's tagline, Wir sind alle Freaks, we are all freaks, appears both on the official poster and as a hashtag to promote the franchise. This assimilationist rhetoric frames freakishness as an attribute of all individuals rather than as a stigmatized identity that results from institutionalized forms of oppression. Such a version of freak discourse operates in part to bestow humanity upon impaired individuals by convincing able-bodied audiences to recognize and celebrate their own freakishness. By this logic, if every member of the American Horror Story audience is a freak, then simultaneously, no one is a freak, and the marked identity supposedly loses its stigma. This superficial celebration of sameness fails to recognize that able-bodied individuals do not have the same stakes in claiming the term freak as disabled individuals do in reclaiming the term as a positive identity, if they so choose. This rhetoric is flawed because the inherent humanity of disabled individuals is not something for the wealthy, white, able-bodied male series co-creators to bestow. Such freak discourse could lead audiences to feel paternalistic sympathy or pity for the disabled because the show's rhetoric does not come from the voices of disabled individuals, who have a more nuanced understanding of what it means to claim the identity of freak. Though the show does feature actors with disabilities, these performers are mostly relegated to the background. Of these actors, only Matt Frazier, who plays Paul the Illustrated Seal, has a significant amount of dialogue and character development throughout the season. In answering the question of what has been the most challenging thing about working on Freak Show, Frazier's response, which I have put up here for the sake of time, reveals how the American Horror Story creative team exploits the actors whom Murphy hopes to empower. Instead of having their own voices within the show, the actors with disabilities authenticate the voices of the able-bodied writers, producers, and co-creators. Of significant note is the fact that Frazier specifically says he was upset privately, which suggests that he feels neither comfortable nor able to air his grievances in a more public manner on the set or with showrunners. This situation raises the question of how much consent Frazier ultimately has in his character's representation, given the power imbalance between actors and showrunners. In developing the season's narrative, American Horror Story's writers fail to account for how intersectionality influences the lives and histories of disabled people. Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality refers to a way of conceptualizing discrimination in politics that understands identity as multi-layered rather than structured around singular issues. Deployments of ableism necessarily differ according to how other forms of discrimination operate along the lines of the disabled subject's multiple identities. This nuanced understanding of disability does not translate into American Horror Story's representation of freak show history. Of the 4 groups historically infreaked, no non-disabled people of color from the US appear on the show. Despite the importance of eugenicist logic and common practices of enslavement to freak show history, American Horror Story depicts only ableism as an organizing logic of freak shows. Because the show fails to include any examples of US domestic racism, the show perpetuates an ahistorical, post-racial narrative that removes the nuances of how freak discourse others non-disabled people of color differently than white bodies. Furthermore, this omission is particularly egregious because Murphy references the civil rights movement as a point of inspiration for the season. In essence, he appropriates a civil rights narrative and erases Black lives and histories from it. In telling the story of the show's one disabled Black female character, Angela Bassett's Desiree, Freak Show's writers fail to explore how racism organizes the logics of her enfreakment. Bassett plays a, quote, intersex character with 3 breasts whose disability and storyline revolve around her being a self-identified, quote, full-blown hermaphrodite. Freak Show's creative team requires Bassett to wear a prosthetic 3rd breast that over-sexualizes her. By making Desiree's disability her exoticized body, the show's writers reproduce a legacy of violence against Black women in freak shows. Desiree's characterization evokes the history of Sarah Baartman, the woman from Southern Africa exhibited for white European audiences. Historically, Baartman serves as a sign of racial difference that these audiences use to justify white supremacy and colonialism. Her treatment helps to create modern stereotypes about Black women's sexuality, including the trope of the hypersexualized Jezebel. Similar to Baartman, Desiree's enfreakment revolves around her othered body and genitalia. Desiree functions as an over-sexualized Jezebel whose sexual agency centers on her ability to please white men. She marries Del, a closeted white gay man, and early in the season sleeps with white gay men as a favor in order to turn them straight. Because of her non-normative genitalia and, quote, lascivious sexuality, Desiree serves as a conduit for white gay men to claim a heterosexual identity. Freak Show's writers fail to address how representing Desiree as sexually available to white men is part of the Jezebel trope that historically justifies white male sexual assault and ownership of Black women. By failing to critique these tropes, Freak Show's writers end up perpetuating them. In their treatment of Erica Irvin's Amazon Eve, Freak Show's writers similarly erase her identity as a trans woman from her character's representation. When she auditions for the role of Amazon Eve, which was initially intended for a cisgender male actor, Irvin closeted her transness and performed in male drag with slicked back hair, no makeup, a flannel shirt, bound breasts, and a lowered voice. Even though American Horror Story's creators altered the character specifically for Irvin, they failed to incorporate her trans identity into the show. Amazon Eve becomes a cisgender woman whose defining characteristic is her identity as a giantess. Freak Show's writers have the ability to explore how a white trans woman with a disability navigates the 1950s, which would provide a unique opportunity to make visible aspects of transgender histories that frequently go unrepresented. This story would align with Murphy's plan to give voice to those whom society marginalizes, especially in this contemporary moment when trans people, and particularly trans women of color, face violence, suicide, and homicide at rates far higher than most individuals. In depicting the 2 white gay male characters, Michael Chiklis' Del and Dennis O'Hare's Stanley, the show conflates gayness with disability. Homosexuality and disability do share similar aspects in histories, in their pathologization and medicalization, how they both involve gawking from straight and typical individuals, and how they intertwine with shame and isolation. However, comparing the 2 identities risks creating artificial binaries that unintentionally hierarchize different forms of marginalization. Instead of exploring the intersectional nuances of how disability and sexuality operate in 1950s Florida, Freak Show generates a hierarchy of oppression that frames white gay men as the most oppressed. This hierarchy is apparent in a scene when Emma Roberts' character notices gay erotica that falls out of Stanley's suitcase. She warns Stanley to be more careful in hiding his sexuality because, quote, the only thing people in Jupiter hate more than freaks are poofs. This dialogue both distinguishes freaks from poofs and creates a spectrum of oppression that situates homosexuals above the show's disabled characters. Freak Show's oppression hierarchy is further evidenced through Ryan Murphy's reaction to the gruesome murder of Andy, Del's lover. Murphy calls this event one of the most disturbing things we've ever done and a true horror scene. While Andy's fate is horrific, the fact that Murphy thinks his murder is one of the most horrific scenes in the show's history, a history that includes the massacre of Black women, dismemberment of children, and multiple scenes of rape and violence against women, says a lot about how Murphy understands violence against white gay men in comparison to violence against other marginalized groups. Through the characterization of Del and his relationship to disability, Freak Show suggests that the psychic turmoil of living a closeted life is a more difficult lived experience than having a physical disability. Within the show's narrative, Del has a complex relationship with disability because he can pass as able-bodied. While Dell lacks any visible impairments, his fathers and brothers have ectrodactyl, also known as split hands, and they ostracize Dell for being the one family member without the impairment. In Dell's family, he, quote, becomes a freak for being normal. Because he appears as a hypermasculine, able-bodied white man, Dell has more access to social spaces than the other freaks and faces no harassment when he walks through the town of Jupiter and visits local bars. Despite having these various privileges, Dell appears in the narrative as one of the most tormented characters because of his closeted sexuality. His homosexuality is not initially visible because his hypermasculinity masks his gayness through stereotypical gender presentation, and Freak Show's audience does not learn of Dell's sexuality until the season's 5th episode, 3 episodes after the character's introduction. Before revealing Dell's secret to the audience, the show frames the character as violent for no reason and a threat to the freaks. Once Dell enters the safe space of the gay bar, his characterization shifts significantly as he expresses his sexuality openly. After seeing Dell at the gay bar, Stanley blackmails him into murdering Ma Petite in order to prevent Dell's outing. The resulting guilt Dell experiences from the murder, combined with feelings of shame and abandonment after being told that his lover Andy has left town, drive Dell to attempt suicide. During the scene where Dell attempts to hang himself, he has a conversation with a vision of his dead ex-wife Ethel, during which Ethel suggests that Dell faces a tougher struggle than the other freaks because he lives a closeted life. This conversation explicitly conflates Dell's sexuality with disability. While this exchange does accurately depict how internalized homophobia and self-hate can produce an emotional rot, the dialogue unnecessarily compares a homosexual's experience to the experiences of visibly disabled individuals. The scene suggests that being a closeted gay man is somehow more oppressive because the situation results in psychic turmoil. Whereas visibly disabled individuals learn how to manage their shame, Dell lacks the same luxury because he must keep his homosexuality hidden. This dialogue fails to account for the various privileges Dell enjoys because of his ability to pass. Instead, Dell's psychological torment takes precedence as his defining characteristic. Part of Dell's internal struggle results from his inability to be out in the freak show. His sexuality isolates him from everyone outside the confines of the gay bar, including the other freaks. Because the freaks do not discuss homosexuality openly, the show gives no indication whether or not the environment would be welcoming to Dell. Within the subcultural world of freaks, homosexuality remains pathologized and on the margins, an unspoken and unrecognized identity. Therefore, despite the show's Virzindala Freaks rhetoric, Dell remains too freakish, even for the freaks, and ultimately the most marginalized individual on the show. In conclusion, in framing Freak Show as an exploration of oppression against people with disabilities, Ryan Murphy gives this season an overtly political aim, to give underrepresented people a voice that they otherwise would not have. However, in creating this fictionalized history of freak shows, American Horror Story ultimately presents an historically inaccurate representation that exploits the disabled actors and elevates the oppression of white gay men at the expense of disabled people of color and trans women. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to each of the presenters for being so well prepared and on time with your presentations. It leaves us with some space to have discussion, even though we had a little bit of a late start. So because of that, I'm going to keep my notes to a minimum. I did want to thank each of you for such beautifully prepared and presented papers, and I really love the way they're grouped on this panel today. A couple of threads that I saw through the papers that I'm hoping I can just lay as a beginning for thinking about some of the questions that might come up in terms of the individual papers. I was really struck by how each of you in some ways were addressing, I think, Luis Althusser's ideological state apparatus, and how the attempt to manage this kind of monstrous excess through symbolic and actual bodies, queer bodies, LGBTQ bodies, is both achieved and failed. So through whether it's the media, systemic governments, programs, through mass incarceration, through the medicalisation of certain kinds of bodies, there was success in terms of thinking about improving systems of managing that excess, but also of the failure through the appropriation of language, through the appropriation of ideals, political activism, and both of those kinds of the tensions of both the achievement through the kind of reparation that you're talking about, through the location of the ability to identify and with certain kinds of excess, but also the backlash of that in terms of shame and the production of shaming certain kinds of bodies. And I think that speaks to a kind of idea through particularly the proliferation in media, through the ways in which public and private fears have become so much more visible, so much more accessible, and so much more readable. So I really wanted to thank each of you for those kinds of, and for getting me to think about those ideas again. I definitely want to go back and look again at Halberstam's notion of failure, and the idea of failure as a place of not shame, but of recognizing that the tools that we've been encouraged to use, sometimes in their failure, help us understand what we were encouraged to believe as a success in the first place. And also Jose Munoz's idea of disidentification, which I think actually runs really strongly through each of your papers, and the way that you've brought to light the possibilities and the failures of the systems of representation, and of the kind of genres that we've held as categories that, again, both help us reveal what's happening and understand the failures of those categories simultaneously. So thank you, each of you. And now I'd like to open up the space. We have about 10 minutes before our break, so I would like to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated at how visual cues and how bodies are presented kind of changes throughout all of your talks. In particular, how sometimes what we see visually on someone's body, whether it's clothes, whether it's hairstyle, whether it's their build, whatever, trumps the oral testimony or maybe oral confession, right, that we hear from them, especially in your paper talking about how even if there was the appearance of being queer, that might be something to consider of whether or not someone actually identifies as that. So I just wanted to know if you guys would be, if any of you would be interested in talking a little bit about the connection that you might see between visual appearance and oral testimony and confession, and if there's something that in what you've studied, if they're working together, or if they're functioning apart from each other, or what are the tensions there?
Well, it's interesting because I feel like one of the things about Rocky Horror that kind of allows for this reparative impulse is that there isn't any confession ever. There's appearance and actions, and there's no really having to negotiate through language, which kind of allows for a different sort of negotiation where, the people are kind of, I suppose, saying things about themselves, but there's so much going on that you're kind of drawn in the kind of action and the visual appearance.
Oh, sure. So in terms of what you were alluding to the actual perception of being of queerness in the actual screening process of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, a lot of testimony that I was reading was essentially that it was rooted mostly in stereotypes of what individuals believe that being queer is, which kind of goes back to what you're.
A list of things to look for, or is it just
Yeah, no, thank you. It's completely unregulated as of now. There is no like national screening standard. It's just if the actual individual inmate that's being screened is discloses their sexual orientation or gender identity, or whether or not they're perceived. And that's all it says in the actual like language of the policy, just perception of being LGBT as a risk factor. So of course, since it's a national policy that's, left up to so much interpretation and has a lot of implications for, stereotypes, discrimination on multiple different levels. So yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that.
In my paper, I didn't raise this point, but performing the spectacle of disability is apparent throughout, particularly with the able-bodied actors. And with Matt Fraser's character, they initially wanted his character to have, he has tattoos over his body, that's his own, but they wanted him to tattoo his face as well. He refused to because it's his biggest break and he didn't want to be unrecognizable. So I have another quotation that wasn't included saying that a particular line of dialogue that he found offensive, he thinks was given to him as a punishment because he refused to perform the spectacle of disability in the way the able-bodied producers and creators wanted him to. So vacillating between actual lived experience of disability and the performance of a spectacle.
Very nice. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Question for Carl. My only experience with freak shows is the one time I went to Coney Island, and I think they are touting it as the longest running freak show in the United States. But from what my own probably mostly informed perception, it did seem that everyone performing was an able-bodied person performing the spectacle of freak, and I guess they are connecting the show to the legacy of what might have been an actual true freak show back in, I guess, the 1900s. So I would love to hear your opinion about the politics of kind of recreating a spectacle of freakdom, but through able-bodied people, outside of television and in real life.
With Coney Island in particular, that's where Matt Fraser has performed. One of the performers on the show, he's performed as a freak. He identifies as a freak performer at Coney Island, where he has more agency in his act. He has more say in what political representation he gives of himself. In terms of how it relates to the show, I think that's an area that they don't necessarily investigate. The way that they're just reproducing the performance of disability through able-bodied actors who have no understanding what that lived identity is like. They could have done more with that, I would say, if they would listen to Matt Fraser, if they would have interviewed some of the performing freaks who identify in that way.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for this panel. It's really, really great. There's so many things that came out of all the papers. And I'm especially interested in learning in this reparative activity. It's super interesting. But I had one question. You briefly referred to sort of distinctions between genres of horror and musicals and how Rocky Horror kind of crosses over these genres. And it does have explicitly queer identified and presenting visible characters. I was curious about how it might, how it works, like mechanically, I guess, in comparison to other horror musicals, like Sweeney Todd or Jekyll and Hyde, or if that's something that he's open to in other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this kind of combination is really where my interest gets piqued. I've written a great deal also about the adaptation of Carrie, the film, into a musical. And I mean, the kind of negotiation between these different modes can really, I mean, just the way that something like Rocky Horror invites this kind of ironic interaction, but also very empathetic interaction with it as a film, whereas some things you're just kind of laughing at it directly, and that's kind of its unintentional camp, right? And so I think the combination of those two things gets really complicated, where you have both intentional and unintentional camp in both the horror and the musical modes of it. And so that allows for a kind of broader identification than some of the other ones. Carrie, for example, has like 3 different modes, I think, effectively. A campy one, a serious kind of operatic one, and then a really kind of sentimental saccharine one, which in the kind of original run of it in the 80s made it very uneven, and people didn't like that. So they tried to revise it, and that kind of flattened out all of the differences between all of those modes, and kind of made it a little boring, I think. But something like Rocky Horror, that kind of combination of the horrifying with the musical, as I tried to kind of point out, is kind of what makes it really queer, because these are the 2 genres that had lots of queer representation kind of encoded into it from the get-go, which is kind of what I was trying to get at with like the non-confession, although then I think I was just thinking of Brad and Janet, where obviously Frankenfurter is a sweet transvestite. He kind of takes off his cloak and has that moment. And with that, transvestite being, an identity that people would have claimed for themselves in the 70s.
I'm just thinking also about how maybe there's also silence in musical.
Uh-huh,
right?
yeah. Yeah, and so, I mean, and this is the other thing where people tend to see horror camp as incompatible with kind of more traditional queer forms of camp, because it can be extremely homophobic. And the kinds of camp that happen in horror, because they're not emanating from kind of a lived experience with, for example, a gay man identifying with femininity, experiencing that as a failure, experiencing that as shame. It's just kind of emanating from these learned codes of genre. So it's mean in a different way, and not in a self-defensive way, but in a kind of, and if anyone's been to the New Art Rocky Horror here in LA, the kind of simulcast, shadowcast, it kind of goes back and forth between those 2 modes, where sometimes it feels kind of good and other times it feels really not good. And I think that has to do with the kind of horror camp being a straight male kind of dominated realm. But, looking at the history of queer folks participating in horror as directors, like James Whale, who did, Frankenstein and all those things, and also as the monsters, kind of, yeah.
Yes, please.
I guess I had a question for Carl. That quote at the end where he's talking about, being one thing on the inside and struggling with that in a erotic way. I forget all the exact. But what I noticed was the language is so similar to in Angels in America with the Mormon character when he's talking to Harper about, there were interesting parallels. And so my question, I guess, is about referentiality. If you noticed that, I haven't watched Freak Show, but if they were trying to, in the dialogue or in other ways, refer to other kind of, because I guess in Angels in America you have this Mormon character with his Mormon underwear, and like that he's kind of held up as a curious object as well, right? It's not just his homosexuality that he kind of conceals beneath his suit, but also this other religious identity in the in DC, in the political world of DC. So I'm wondering if Freak Show, if that was just a fluke, or if you noticed like that were there references running throughout, or that's kind of.
I hadn't made that point of connection. That's a really good one. There are some camp references throughout the season, particularly with I think it was the 1940s movie Freaks. They reproduced some same scenes from that movie, some of the similar plot lines. So there is an element of queer camp in the referentiality, but again, it's not from the lived experience of queerness. so much as it's using the spectacle of disability. But in that, the reference you're raising, I can see that really well.
Okay, so according to the bells, we're finished for today. Is there any final burning questions anyone would like to address in the group in general, or feel free? I think each of the presenters, their work is amazing and they would love to hear from you on an individual basis if you get a chance throughout the day. So if we could just thank our presenters one more time. Beautiful job, really lovely. And you have a break now from 11 to 11:15 for the next panel. I believe the refreshments are still outside. Lovely to see you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.